He was like the barker in a circus. You know, the barker in a circus say, step right up, folks, the big show's on the inside. Put your dime in and go inside. He was that way. He was like the circus barker, not just now and then, but constantly.
Colonel was the shrewdest, most brilliant businessman and con artist I ever met in my entire life.
I did not like the Colonel, and I'm sorry what he did to Elvis. And actually, you know, I love the guy.
I have no dirt to throw at the Colonel.
Well, he was a jerk, man, you know.
Colonel Parker's sense of humor never stopped.
Colonel had a great sense of humor. But when it came to business, it was hardcore business.
He was a much more interesting man than Elvis was. I found him absolutely fascinating, and I wouldn't trust him across the room.
He had style, he knew it, and he flaunted it.
And the Colonel just cashed in, didn't care about Elvis's dream.
You had to be there to understand, so I don't care what anybody tells me. I was there. I saw what I saw, and it just was meant to be that way.
Live up to my reputation of being a nice guy. This is it, folks. Beautiful, baby.
Colonel Tom Parker wasn't really a colonel. His first name wasn't really Tom, and his last name wasn't really Parker. Other than that, much of what you've heard about this colorful character is also shrouded in mystery.
He never really talked too much about his early years. I never even knew he changed his name until I read it in a book or I saw it in a newspaper someplace. Somebody said, you know, he was Von something. I don't even know the name. I just know it was Colonel Tom Parker.
Although he claimed to have been born in Huntington, West Virginia, Andreas Cornelius Van Kuijik came into this world on June 26, 1909, in Breda, Holland.
When the Colonel was a young man, he was always big for his age, he said. I mean, tall. He was 6 feet tall, although in later years he became a bit stooped. But he was about 6 feet tall. And when he was a young man in Holland, one of his jobs was carrying big rounds of cheese from the factory onto the barges.
When he was 20, Andreas stowed away on board an ocean liner and entered the United States an illegal alien. He immediately joined the U.S. Army and set aside his Dutch heritage to take the name of his commanding officer, Thomas Parker.
It all seemed, kind of, strange that, that he felt the way he did, that maybe somehow he didn't belong here, or that somehow in the end it wasn't totally legal for him to be here. I never understood that part of it, but that was part of the Colonel.
I asked the Colonel one time after Elvis passed away, I said, I never knew you were a non-citizen. He says, well, Joe, I was in the Army for 2 years. He says, and to be that made me a citizen because I served in the Army, in the United States Army. And he says, nobody ever asked me. He said, if somebody had asked me if I was a U.S. citizen, I would have said no.
After leaving the Army in 1932, Parker was hired as a barker with a traveling carnival called the Johnny J. Jones Exposition. It was a job that would have a far-reaching influence on the rest of his life.
He was like the barker in a circus. You know, the barker in a circus say, step right up, folks, the big show's on the inside.
The big show's about to start. See Goliath, the most infernal beast.
Oh, Colonel loved to talk about the carnival days. He felt very proud about that. I mean, he was more or less the PR guy for the carnivals that he worked with. But he did everything. He was a barker. He did the games. He sold hot dogs, and it's a famous story about the canaries. He had these. They get these sparrows, and they would spray them yellow and sell them as canaries. Canaries were too expensive, but sparrows were free, so that's what they do. They'd spray them and sell them. Then the dancing chickens, another famous story.
They would throw down some chicken feed on this hot plate, and the chickens were, it was hot, and they were dancing around, and they were trying to eat the chicken feed at the same time.
They'd be jumping all around. Those were funny to us.
He was a con man. He was a man who wasn't even here legally in this country. He was a man who did a carny show by putting he had a dancing chicken act He put this chicken on a hot stove and made it jumped around, and he called it the dancing chicken. What else can you say?
By now, Parker had married Marie Mott Ross, whom he'd met while working with the carnival in Florida. One legend that dogged Parker all his life had to do with a patent medicine of questionable repute, known as Hadacol.
We first became aware of Colonel Parker when we were touring Texas. And we looked on the billboards, and throughout Texas there were these huge signs, "Drink Hadacol." My uncle, who was an ordained minister, said to my mother, "You know, I feel so much better lately because I have started drinking Hadacol, and it really makes me feel great." So we found out later that Hadacol had a high percentage of alcohol. I thought that was funny. But Colonel Parker was at my house with his lovely wife, and I said, "Oh, here we go." I said, "I have to tell you, I always think of you as the Hadacol man." And you know something? He didn't really want to hear that. He bristled a bit.
After selling Hadacol, I guess he figured he could sell anything, you know.
Colonel Parker had nothing whatsoever to do with Hadacol. He told me many times, he said, "Joe, I don't know where they come up with these stories. I know nothing about Hadacol. I never had a bottle in my hand."
He had nothing to do with Hadacol. The reason I'm saying that, they tried to hire me. He wouldn't let them have me as a performer.
By the early 40s, Parker had begun a new career as a manager for up-and-coming singers, another job that would have far-reaching consequences.
He managed Gene Austin, country singer, very famous country singer back in the 40s. And then he handled Eddie Arnold, and he managed him.
When we'd be in a town and there'd be a circus or whatever it happened to be, he'd take me and introduce me to these people. I met people that I never thought about meeting that was in the circus business, because he was an old carny, and they help one another. They really do. They help one another, and he did.
In 1948, the governor of Louisiana bestowed on Parker an honorary military title. Parker immediately announced to his assistant, "From now on, see to it that everyone addresses me as the Colonel." In 1953, Eddie Arnold, in a move still shrouded in mystery, sent the Colonel a telegram informing him that his services were no longer required.
I don't know how Eddie and the Colonel split. All I know is that we remained friends till Colonel passed away.
Yes, I did eulogy for him and would do it again today.
Around this time, a young singer from Tupelo, Mississippi, was just starting to make a name for himself down south. His manager was a young disc jockey named Bob Neal.
Bob Neal was still managing Elvis at that time. He was a Memphis disc jockey. And he got Elvis on these shows because Elvis was making some noise in the South.
Now, I think Bob knew, though, he couldn't handle him because he didn't know what to do with him. He didn't know where to go with him, and I think he realized Colonel Parker could take him to far better places than he could have.
In 1955, the Colonel's assistant, Oscar Davis, informed his boss that this Presley fellow was worth taking a look at.
When Elvis came along, Colonel was not managing anybody, okay? He more or less had shows. He would put country shows around, Hank Snow and stuff like that. He was booking shows around the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, somebody mentioned to him, I can't think who it was, about, "I saw this kid at this club one time. You got to see this kid. You should book him on one of your shows." So Colonel said, "Okay, we'll try him out." So he booked him, and Colonel didn't even see him. And then he went to the show, and he saw the reaction.
And Elvis sometimes had to come back for 2 and 3 encores because they just wouldn't leave. Finally, at the end of those tours, they put Elvis on last.
Well, he saw there's something pretty good here, and he booked him more and more, and then eventually he had to be the closing act, because even Hank Snow got mad about that when Elvis had to open the show for him. Then eventually he was opening the show for Elvis.
But he knew that the reaction from the audiences was pretty strong. So he did his homework, did his research, and found out that Elvis's contract was coming up pretty soon.
He worked at Elvis to about becoming his manager, and that's basically what happened.
By early 1956, the Colonel, who wasn't even Elvis's official manager yet, had succeeded in switching Presley from the relatively obscure Sun Records label to more prestigious RCA. and arranged for him to make his national television debut.
Last year in '55, my manager was Bob Neal, who was a disc jockey in Memphis. And we organized Elvis Presley Enterprises and had an office. But when I signed up with Colonel Tom Parker in Nashville, we didn't figure we needed the office anymore, so he's handed everything out of Nashville.
On the Ides of March 1956, Colonel Tom Parker signed Elvis Presley as his one and only client, although signed might not be the right word.
There was never a contract signed between the two men. It was a conversation, a gentleman's agreement, and a handshake. And throughout all the years that they were together, they both honored that contract.
It was much more than manager and artist. It was like surrogate father, best big brother, uncle, or something to that effect. Colonel Parker actually got pretty close to Elvis. And so Elvis really went along with almost everything Colonel Parker suggested, because Colonel Parker had gotten him to the top, kept Elvis on top. So he more or less followed the direction of Colonel Tom Parker, and they were very good friends in addition to being Colonel Parker being his manager.
Having conquered records, radio, and television, for which he received 25% of Elvis's earnings, Parker arranged for Presley to take on Hollywood, once again using his persuasive managerial style to swing an unprecedented deal with the studios.
Before Elvis Presley, nobody ever got a piece of a movie. They got a salary and that was it. Colonel was the only man that started where artists got a piece of the picture. So that changed how a lot of other managers and agents started doing that with other stars. Colonel was always very tough when it comes to money. Money up front, because he knows by the end of it, when he goes through all the bookkeeping on Hollywood, you never get a dime on the percentage you got coming. So he always said, I want it up front. That's why Elvis Presley was the first man to get $1 million a picture, plus a piece of the movie.
If I ever saw the Colonel, and I saw a lot of the Colonel in Palm Springs, I would always ask him about something, and he'd say, ma'am, I don't know anything about the other side of Elvis's life. You want to talk to me a little bit about the business life? I can tell you everything about the business life, and please know that I have 50% of everything he makes.
The deal is outrageous. The deal is outrageous. In fact, it's outrageous back when Elvis is getting 50% of the profits for his movies, because Elvis, of course, is not really getting 50% of the profits for those pictures because of the way his deal is structured with the Colonel. The Colonel is becoming fabulously wealthy.
Colonel Parker never took 50% of Elvis' earnings. Never.
The Colonel always was bringing him movies in which there was a great deal of music and singing, and I'm quite sure it was all for financial reasons, because it was either publishing that they could own, or there were records that they were involved with that they could make money from, and the Colonel was always interested on one level from the financial point of view.
Well, you know, everybody blames everything on everybody else, but ultimately it's Elvis Presley. He makes the decisions. You know, I mean, I'm sure he did not make a lot of right decisions in his life either, but he's the one that could have made the change. Nobody else could make the changes. Even Colonel Parker couldn't make changes, because if Elvis stood his ground, Colonel had no choice.
He should have let Elvis do what Elvis wanted to do, because Elvis knew what he wanted to do, and that was to play and sing.
He would always let Elvis make the creative decisions. He would present it with opportunities, and Elvis would say yes or would say no. Do you want to do this movie? Do you want to do this script? Do you want to do these songs? All those creative choices were Elvis's.
Elvis had finished a picture, and I said, what do you do next, Elvis? And he said, I don't know, the Colonel hasn't told me yet.
He never interfered with the creative part of Elvis. He said, Elvis is a star. He knows exactly what he's doing. I'm not going to tell him what to sing or how to dress or how to act. He knows how to do those things. I just do the business part.
The Colonel was Elvis. If you wanted to pay respects to Elvis, you paid respects to the Colonel, and that was it. The Colonel was that great buffer. If the Colonel approved of you, everything was cool.
Oh yeah, there were always people that wanted to meet Elvis, always dignitaries and politicians that wanted to meet Elvis. Colonel just had a simple answer, no.
The guy was, you know, he
He played the homespun part. He was far from that, of course, as we know. He was brilliant.
He was one of the sharpest con men that I've ever run across.
Every time you'd see Colonel Parker, he'd be reaching in his pocket and sticking things in your pocket. He'd be putting a button on your lapel.
I noticed that on one side of the fairground, it's I like Elvis buttons, and the other side is I hate Elvis buttons. And what do you think of that, Elvis? He said, well, everyone's got an opinion, but did you look at the back? And then one of the guys turned over and said, oh, for crying out loud, Elvis Presley Enterprises, on both of them.
By the late 60s, Elvis's popularity as a box office draw was slipping, causing the studio brass to rethink his contract.
Colonel Parker thought for a moment. He said, you know, he said, you're absolutely right. My boy may not be around too much longer. Therefore, I think we ought to, since this is probably going to be his last film, we ought to double the price. And he got it. He said, you started the negotiation, as I understand it, right? Colonel Parker walked out of that meeting getting twice as much as Elvis would have gotten if he'd have stayed just under the normal contract.
I was there, yes, with some of the deals that the Colonel made. He was a very shrewd bargainer. You know, he paid a lot of dues, the Colonel. Came up, you know, in the old Carney days when you really had to be on your toes every second.
Men did like Colonel because he was a strong individual and he did great business deals and he was very smart. He did a lot of things. And women, Colonel was not real warm with women.
Yeah, he was not an approachable person. I didn't care for him, I guess, because he was just different than everybody else on that, you know, connected with the movie. He was very standoffish.
Elvis had a dream, and the Colonel just cashed in. Didn't care about Elvis's dream. Cared about the cash. Cared about the Colonel. And if a man's dream dies, then so does the man.
I was worried also about the Colonel. And he said, oh, my personal life is my own. The Colonel just directs my career. And of course, now we see that's not true at all. He was behind everything.
He liked to bluff people, see how scared you'd be of him. But then when you weren't, then, you know, he said, oh, well, this is one that won't take my bluff.
But once he got to know you, he loved kids. He loved, you know, he was very friendly to all our wives and girlfriends once he got to know them. Animals, loved animals. So any person that loves animals and kids has got to be, you know, have a good heart. I mean, it's true. And Elvis loved animals and kids too, but he loved women too.
Colonel Parker played practical jokes, but never to hurt a person. I've never known him to do a joke that was harmful to the person. He was very sensitive about people's feelings. Colonel was a moonchild. They have a great sensitivity.
There were a number of cases when we're in the office and somebody would call and he would answer the phone not as Colonel Parker, but as an anonymous assistant.
Is this Colonel Parker's office? Colonel says, yes. Who is this? This is Sam Ferguson. Oh, and he could hear her in the background talking to her friend saying, I've got Colonel Parker's office on the phone. Sam Ferguson answered the phone. Is Elvis there? No. But he just left. Hold on, and I'll see if I can catch him before he gets to the elevator. And he puts the phone down, and we're all sitting there just, our mouths are open. They picked up the phone. He says, oh, I'm so sorry. I just missed him. But I tried. Try later.
Howdy, hi, this is the Colonel. I said, Colonel, it's Red Robinson in Vancouver. Oh, yeah, Red, how are you? I said, well, Tom Moffat told me to call Elvis in the room. You just missed him. I'll never know, but to this day, I think Elvis was in the room. But I recorded my conversation with the Colonel.
You know, I was wondering if it would be possible to talk to Elvis. Maybe not, but he said you're the man to call.
Gosh, I wish you'd have called about 10 minutes ago. He just left.
Oh, for crying out loud.
Just walk out of here.
One of the more amusing manifestations of Parker's sense of humor was a rather exclusive club he founded himself.
For those that don't know, the Snowman's Club was a fictitious club that the Colonel was president of, or chief potentate, I think he called himself. And it was strictly for anybody who was great at knowing how to BS you became a member of Colonel Parker's Snowman's Club.
Colonel was the most high potentate of the Snowmen's League of America, and our slogan was, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. You've heard of snow jobs.
So people that he thought were good snowmen, he would invite in, and he was the chief potentate of the Snowmen's League of America. So there was a long period in there where we didn't even call him Colonel, we called him potentate.
It was so much fun to see new members get their book because they were excited about it. And they would start and they would look at the first part and they would read a few basic rules, and then they would come to this section that was all blank pages.
He was promoting when he handed you a book with nothing written down on the pages. he took you, you know?
When you can read everything on every page, you're a real member. And they would give him this look, what is this about? And then he would say, a real snowman reads between the lines.
In 1967, Elvis married Priscilla in Las Vegas, a city that would have great significance for both Elvis and the Colonel.
The Colonel said, come on, nudged me. He said, come on. Where was he going? He loved roulette. And roulette was his game. And we went out. He bought about $50,000 worth of chips, which at that time I think was about 1967 it was, and $50,000 was a big buy. And while he was playing, he said, this is the luckiest casino for me. So I always suspected that that's why he selected that one to have the wedding at, because it was a good chance for him to get out. And by the way, he lost the $50,000.
Although gambling would prove to be a worrisome vice, Parker had no problem avoiding other temptations.
I used to drive him sometimes from L.A. to Palm Springs to his home. We'd stop halfway down there. I said, Joe, stop and get a beer. Well, I'd never do the Colonel ever to drink. So I said, okay. He said, let's split a beer. We'd split a beer. Apparently, he never ever said it. Maybe he was one of those guys when he was young that when he drank, he was a completely different person. I had that feeling about it. So he knew he couldn't drink. And that was the only time I ever saw him have anything with alcohol.
You know, I don't recall that the Colonel ever drank, but he did enjoy a great cigar, and we always had cigars on tour.
In 1969, Elvis began performing at the International Hotel, signifying the official start of his Vegas years.
I first met Colonel Parker in 1969, in the spring of 1969, when he came into Las Vegas to sign the contract for the opening at the International Hotel. And the hotel wasn't even opened at that time. It was still under construction. The romance bloomed because Colonel and I were kindred spirits. We had a personal relationship before we had a working relationship. At that time, his wife was suffering from what they now would call Alzheimer's. She didn't always even know Colonel. His life was a sad life at home.
You could go to Vegas with him when Elvis was there, and he might stay up all night in the casino or just at the hotel and go get 2 hours sleep, and the rest of us, who are a lot younger than the Colonel, would just be dragging, and he would be full of pep.
When they were filming That's the Way It Is at the International Hotel, the fans from the back had started to move forward, and he was about to be mobbed, and Colonel jumped up, ran up, picked up Elvis, and put him on the other side of a barrier. And I sat there, I absolutely could not believe it. He came back, sat down, like nothing had happened, and I said, Colonel, you're back, are you all right? And he said, I had to help him.
With Vegas now his center of operations, the Colonel was able to indulge his vice with even more passion than in earlier years.
Colonel liked to gamble. We first started playing Las Vegas. I mean, we didn't know this till we went to Vegas. I mean, until we started playing there. And I'd see him at the roulette wheel, and he'd say, Joe, sit down, play. We'd play some roulette, you know. And little by little, I think he got hooked.
You know, he was gambling, and when you gamble, you'll sell your mother. I didn't sell my mother for too long, just 2 days I sold my mother. She overcame that.
Colonel Parker was a tremendous gambler. I mean, when Elvis was working at the Hilton Hotel, he lost literally millions of dollars. And that's why he booked Elvis in there a lot of times. And I don't think Elvis ever really knew how much money that was being taken from him.
My manager, Colonel Tom Parker, where is he? Is the Colonel around anywhere? Oh, he's out playing roulette. Don't kid me. I know what he's doing. Him and Cosby out there talking mash and drinking trash or whatever.
Despite Elvis's kidding, there may have been some genuine frustration behind those words.
If the Colonel would come in the room, I mean, it was like, anything, whatever you want. And then as the years wore on and as their relationship deteriorated, would be in Vegas seeing Elvis, and he would, for spite, sing the songs that the Colonel hated the most, just to make the Colonel, upset, and the Colonel would be outside gambling Elvis's next paycheck.
I think the Colonel kind of boxed him in. Elvis, the feeling I had about Elvis is he wanted more of a life, and he was having less of a life.
I know from many conversations with Elvis that he was adamant about letting go of Colonel Parker, finding a new manager, and he wanted to have a different lifestyle than the one he was leading.
They were a great match, but like all good matches, there came a time when the Colonel should have eased, and I don't think he did.
Colonel